There's a place in Switzerland called the Vallée des Joux. It's a long, quiet valley, surrounded by mountains, forests all around. If you look it up on a map, it barely stands out. But in the world of watches, this quiet valley gave rise to names that would define modern watchmaking. Names like Joux, JLC, known for building some of the most technically advanced movements. Audemars Piguet, still family owned, still based there. But before these names became global companies, this valley belonged to something else entirely. Independent watchmakers. People who gave their entire lives perfecting details no one would ever notice. Slow, disciplined, uncompromising. Work measured not in profits, but in patience. That spirit eventually found its clearest expression in one man who decided to take everything this valley stood for and distill it into his own watches. Watches made almost entirely by hand. Watches that would come to represent the purest form of traditional watchmaking. This man is Philippe Dufour. As of the release of this episode, Dufour is 77 years old, and over the span of his 58 years career as a watchmaker, he has only ever made 3 models of watches. First is the Grande Petite Sonnerie wristwatch, the first of its kind ever made, a watch that chimes the time every 15 minutes, with each quarter hour having its own unique sound, all without batteries. It took him 2 to 3 years to make one watch. He made 8 in total, with one selling for $7.63 million, a record-breaking price at the time, and still the second most expensive independent timepiece. Then came the Duality, the first wristwatch to feature a double balance with differential, a technical solution that improves stability and accuracy. He made 9 in total, with one selling for 3.6 million Swiss francs, around $4.6 million. The simplicity came last. At a glance, it's almost plain. 3 hands and nothing more. No distractions. But inside, every part, visible or not, is finished by hand to the highest degree, using traditional tools, the same techniques passed down for generations. Took him several months to make one watch. He made around 220 in total, with one selling for 1.36 million Swiss francs, around $1.5 million. Originally, only a little over 200 simplicities were ever meant to exist. They were made slowly, about 15 a year over more than a decade. That was it. But the watch became something else entirely. Demand grew far beyond what one man could ever produce. Even today, only a handful are made. I'll go deeper into each of these 3 watches later. How they work, why they matter, and what makes them so special. These watches were shaped in silence, each one a careful testament to a craft almost lost. A craft few were willing to endure. A craft carried by a single pair of hands. And that brings us to the man himself. Long before the simplicity, before collectors, waiting lists, and record prices, before his name meant anything at all. Born in 1948 in the village of Sentier in the Vallée des Joux, he grew up in a watchmaking family. His father worked in a watch factory, his mother assembled small components at home, and his grandfather was a watchmaker as well. The tools of the trade were not distant objects to him. They were on the table, in drawers, in the hands of his family. Some of the tools he used today once belonged to his grandfather. But watchmaking was not a childhood dream. It was more of a compromise. His lack of interest in books closed many doors. And in the Vallée des Joux, there aren't many doors. In the 60s, most people either worked in farming or watchmaking. There wasn't much else to do. On the other hand, he loved taking things apart and fixing them. His old Triumph motorcycle fascinated him way more than any school books. And that's where he began to think that maybe being a mechanic might be the right path. And so his parents sent him to a technical school in the valley, where he was immediately tested. His results were clear. His examiners told him that his math skills were deemed insufficient. That his head and hands worked well together, but not well enough. Just good enough. Just good enough to be a watchmaker. And so, his destiny was set. At 15, he entered watchmaking school almost by accident. No ambition, no passion, just necessity. But then something changed. In the first few months of watchmaking school, before working on a watch, you are told to craft your own tools. You are taught how to machine and mount a solid block of steel or brass to create something useful. This is how it's been done for generations in the Vallée des Joux, a practice that Dufour had carried with him throughout his career. Handmade tools making handmade watches. Only once these tools are finished, you can start working on your school watch from start to finish, to produce a fully functioning timepiece. This 4 years journey was one that he describes as magical, when he learned to turn raw brass and steel into something functional, something precise, something alive. He learned that with enough care, you could make time move with your own hands. So with this, a trait that has been assigned to him almost by default gradually became a true passion. He completed his 4 years of training with distinction, earning the title of horologer rehabilia. This title means that Dufour is a fully trained watchmaker who is qualified to completely dismantle, repair, restore and reassemble a mechanical watch from start to finish. At the time, this was a big deal. It wasn't just a certificate. It meant you were trusted to handle complicated mechanical watches on your own. You weren't just assembling parts on a factory line. You were a complete watchmaker. But something didn't sit right with him, as Dufour later recalled. In watchmaking school, they tell you that those in the Valley are the best. Only we can make watches to such high standards. This belief was everywhere in the Valley. It was in the air he breathed. But for Dufour, belief alone wasn't enough. He was curious. More than anything, he dreamt of leaving the Valley. He wanted to know what existed beyond the Valley, beyond the mountains. This drove him to seek a job with one of the most renowned brands in watchmaking, JLC. One of the most respected watchmakers in the Vallée de Joux, known for making some of the finest movements in the world. But before starting, there was an important detail he wanted to add into his contract, the chance to be sent abroad. And so at 19, he went off. His first departure took him to Germany, working in after-sales service, then England, where he helped reorganize service operations and train watchmakers. It was there, fixing worn, damaged and neglected watches, that Dufour learned something essential. A timepiece should be not just a precision instrument, but a dependable companion, designed to last. Okay, so one thing I love about stories like this is spotting early signs of brilliance. One such example would be during his work trip in Germany. He noticed a pattern. A tiny pinion in a particular caliber kept wearing out over and over again. And when he got back to Switzerland, he told his bosses what he had seen, claiming that there must have been a manufacturing defect in that part. They asked him how many times he had seen it happen. He said 5. To them, that was nothing, just a tiny fraction of all the watches they were making. I'm sure the overall production is in the hundreds, if not the thousands. But to him, 5 was already too many. That tiny imperfection mattered. Every detail mattered. And to his frustration, nothing changed. This kind of precision isn't unique to Dufour. The world's greatest craftsmen often share the same obsession with detail. An obsession most people would call excessive. But that's what makes them different. You see this in Steve Jobs. He was obsessed over the inside of the original Macintosh. Parts no customer would ever see. You see this in Elon Musk. He would walk factory floors, pushing engineers to shave off milliseconds, millimeters, fractions most companies will ignore. At JLC, Dufour learned many things. But the most important takeaway from his time there didn't come from the watches themselves. It came from one person, his first colleague, Gabriel Locatelli, a man Dufour will later say had the biggest influence on his education and mindset as a watchmaker, and would develop a deep relationship that would quietly shape one of Dufour's most loved watches. The simplicity. After spending time in England, Dufour returned to the Valley to help train JLC watchmakers on their newest movement, the Caliber 352, a Swiss-made quartz watch. Quartz watches are battery-powered. How it works is that the battery sends an electrical current through the quartz crystal. It's not the big, shiny crystal like the ones you see in stores, but a very small piece of a real quartz crystal that's carefully cut into a thin shape, often like a tiny tuning fork. Electrifying the crystal creates vibrations. It vibrates at a very specific frequency, usually 32,768 times per second. That extremely stable vibration is what keeps the watch accurate. The vibrations are then processed by a circuit board, which regulates them at 1 electrical pulse per second. These pulses are then used to drive a small motor, which turns the gears to rotate the hands of the watch face. They are cheap, fast to make, and requires almost no skill to assemble. The complete opposite of the painstaking mechanical watches Dufour loved, and it wasn't just their simplicity that mattered. Quartz watches were also incredibly accurate, and for decades, Swiss watchmaking was built on a simple promise: precision. Quartz broke that promise. A quartz watch didn't rely on springs, gears, or human adjustment. It used a battery and a crystal that vibrated at a perfectly steady rhythm. That rhythm never got tired, never slipped, never needed a master's touch. And it didn't come from Switzerland. In 1969, a Japanese company, Seiko, released the Astron, the world's first mass-produced quartz wristwatch, which sparked the Quartz Crisis that nearly destroyed Swiss watchmaking. Almost overnight, mechanical watches went from being precision instruments to expensive curiosities. Swiss industry employment collapsed from around 90,000 people to around 30,000 by the late 1980s, a loss of roughly 60,000 jobs, about 2/3 of the workforce. Factories closed, workshops disappeared, master watchmakers were told their skills were no longer needed. This collapse became known as the Quartz Crisis. Ironically, Japan, the very country that had threatened the survival of mechanical watchmaking, would later become the source of Dufour's most passionate following. So the thought of Dufour, a man devoted to hand finishing every gear, spring and screw, who cared deeply about shaping steel by hand, explaining circuit boards and batteries, is hilarious. So naturally he found the work uninspiring. He said the work was easy and repetitive. It was the exact opposite of the meticulous, obsessive craft that would later define him. So this pushed him to look for something else, somewhere else. A newspaper ad caught his attention. The company was looking for a watchmaker to lead a movement workshop in the Virgin Islands. So he packed his bag and went off to the Caribbean. But what was meant to be a 3-year program was cut short by a year due to the dollar crash in 1974. At 26, Dufour was unemployed. When Dufour returned to Switzerland, he was hired by Gerard Ganda, the designer behind Patek Philippe's Nautilus and Audemars Piguet's Royal Oak. The work there was intense. Every part was shaped with extreme care, and the level of attention to detail really spoke to Dufour. Still, it wasn't a great fit. Dufour later said the two of them clashed, not because of ability, but personality. Both men were deeply confident, opinionated, and set in their ways, too headstrong to move in the same direction. So Dufour moved on. He spent about a year at Audemars Piguet as a flat movement regulator, further honing his expertise, and then came across a small ad for a company in Lecoq-de-France called Comma Watches. At the time, the owner of Comma had just bought a batch of old pocket watch movements, repeaters, and chronographs. They needed to be refurbished, cased, and brought back to life. But no one really understood what state they were in or how much work they would take. Dufour wanted to find out. He started by asking friends for help. He gave one movement to each of his 2 watchmaking friends and asked them to take the watches apart, study them, and put them back together. Sometime later they returned, not with 2 working watches, but with 2 small boxes. Inside were hundreds of tiny parts, every screw, every lever, every spring fully taken apart, nothing reassembled. That's when it became clear that this wasn't a simple refurbishment. This was going to be difficult, slow, and expensive. The owner of Comma grew frustrated. What he thought was a good business opportunity was turning into a burden he didn't want to carry. And around that time, Dufour and the owner started to clash. So he took this as an opportunity and made a proposal. He would buy the movements himself for exactly what the owner had paid and take full responsibility for them. No more risk, no more headaches. The owner agreed. At 29 years old, almost without planning, Dufour was independent. Once again, his life had shifted not by some grand plan, but by circumstances. Just as he didn't really choose watchmaking, it seemed like he didn't exactly choose independence either. It simply appeared in front of him, and he stepped into it. But reality followed quickly. A few pocket watch movements wouldn't be enough to support a family, so Dufour went looking for work. He approached auction houses, offering his skills as a restorer. The first to say yes was an auction house that would later become known as Antiquarium. The deal was simple. They would bring him old pocket watches, he would restore them, and prepare them for auction. And through that work, something unexpected happened. Handling these watches day after day, Dufour fell in love with the pieces made in the Vallée de Joux between 1800s and 1920. Watches created before industrialization, when everything was done by hand and every decision rested with the watchmaker. In restoring the past, Dufour discovered the kind of future he wanted to build. For 6 years, Dufour did his work every day. He restored complicated pocket watches, one after another. And each time he lifted a dial, he discovered mechanisms of astonishing ingenuity, clever solutions, elegant shortcuts, and ideas that felt far ahead of their time. Slowly, a pattern began to appear. It didn't matter where the watch came from, Swiss, German or English. Again and again, the heart of the watch told a familiar story. 7 times out of 10, the movements inside the watch had begun his life in the Vallée de Joux. That's when a question crept in. Maybe, just maybe what he was taught in school was right. Maybe the Vallée really was special. Maybe watches from the Vallée are the best. That was the first spark of Dufour's obsession over classical design. But it was still just a small flame, and Dufour wasn't ready to believe in it yet. He wanted proof. So he went searching through old records and eventually found a JLC catalogue from the 1900s. The catalogue showed eboches. Eboche is the unfinished core of a mechanical watch. Just the main plates, screws and gears. It is not decorated and it is not ready to be worn. He found many that were different on the surface, but with the same origins. When he looked past the dial, past the signature, the movement almost always began in the Vallée de Joux. That's when Dufour's belief fully formed. He came to believe that this classical way of watchmaking, slow, precise, and timeless, didn't belong only in museums or archives. It deserved a second life. So he set himself a challenge. He decided to channel this burning flame into his own movement. He thought to himself, what if he created his own complicated pocket watch? This challenge, which seemed audacious, became an obsession. He poured every spare hour into it, nights, weekends and holidays. Every hour went into crafting one of the most demanding complications in watchmaking. A Grande Sonnerie minute repeater, built entirely in the traditional way. One important detail to note, This Grande Sonnerie mini repeater was a pocket watch, not the wristwatch he would later become famous for. That would come much later. When I first saw a Grande Sonnerie mini repeater, I thought this was just another complicated watch. But the more I researched into it, the more I realized this wasn't normal at all. Here's what I've gathered. At its core, it's a watch that tells time by sound, not just when you ask it to, but on its own. Every hour, it rings the hours. Every 15 minutes, it rings the quarters. Both with its own unique sound, all day, all night, automatically. Tiny hammers strike thin metal rings, each hit tuned by hand. If anything is slightly off, the watch either sounds wrong or stops working completely. That alone is a Grande Sonnerie. A mini repeater is when you manually slide a lever and the watch will chime the exact time, down to the minute. There is merely 3 sets of chime, low, high, and both low and high at the same time. How it works is that you will first hear a lower pitch chime. This represents the hours, so if you hear 6 chimes, it means it's 6 o'clock. The second chime pairs low and high tones, which represents the quarter hours, so every 15 minutes. So if you hear 2 sets, 15 times 2, 30 minutes, so it's 6:30. Finally, there is a high-pitched chime, indicating individual minutes. Let's say it's 11 chimes. So after we take the 6 hours, 30 minutes, and then the 11 minutes at the end, it means the time is 6:41. That is a mini repeater. Dufour combined them both. The watch chimed the time automatically every quarter hour, and it also chimes the time on demand. That means 2 different systems, sharing the same tiny parts, working perfectly together, without ever arguing, jamming, or breaking. Now, a Grande Sonnerie mini repeater has been around for centuries. Breguet, Patek Philippe, and Audemars Piguet had already built incredible pocket watches that could do this. But those watches are made in a very different world. They came from big workshops with teams of specialists, decades of accumulated know-how, and almost unlimited time. Dufour was alone. No teams, no departments, just one man. And more importantly, Dufour wasn't just particular about what he built. How he built it matters as well. He decided to build it in the old way, the way watchmakers worked generations ago. At that time, brands were using computer-controlled machines, specialized departments, teams where one person made one part, and machines cut metal with perfect precision and consistency. If a part didn't fit, you simply made another one. That was the normal way forward. Dufour chose the opposite. Inspired by the makers that came before him in the Vallée de Joux, he worked almost entirely with traditional tools, hand files, polishing wood, steel burnishes, simple tools guided by touch and sound. A good example of this comes during the final stages of polishing. To achieve a flawless finish, different types of wood are needed. One of them comes from a plant that grows near Dufour's workshop. Every year, just before the snow falls, Dufour goes out to collect what he needs and turns them into polishing tools when he returns. Every surface was shaped by hand, every edge finished by eye, every adjustment made slowly. Now imagine doing that on a Grande Sonnerie mini repeater. A watch where hundreds of parts must interact perfectly just to make a sound. If a hammer is slightly too heavy, the chime sounds dull, too light, and it doesn't ring properly. If a gear isn't polished just right, it steals power and the watch goes silent. There is no margin for error. He adjusted everything by hand until it felt right and sounded right. This is why this way of watchmaking almost disappeared. It takes too long. It's too risky. It demands years of experience just to avoid ruining the watch altogether. And remember, this wasn't him pushing boundaries after a long career of making complicated watches. This was his first watch. When it was finished, Dufour showed it to collectors, dealers, and distributors. They all said the same thing. Yes, very good, very nice. And then nothing. Silent, no orders. Then a friend made a simple suggestion. Show it to a brand. See if they might commission it. Dufour already had connections at Audemars Piguet, so he brought the watches to them. This time the answer was different. They ordered 5 movements. It was his first official commission as an independent watchmaker. And even if 5 sounds small, it was anything but small. Each movement would take around 2,000 hours to complete. 2,000 hours. Let's say he slept for 8 hours and worked every waking hour. That would need 125 days to complete a watch. Around 4 months. That's if he works and sleeps and do nothing else. But realistically, it takes an entire year of meticulous and relentless effort per piece, made entirely by hand, using traditional tools, just as the great watches of the Vallée de Joux had always been made. Over the next 6 years, he crafted the 5 Grande Sonnerie pocket watches one by one, delivering the first in 1982 at 34 years old, and the last by 1988 at 40 years old. It was slow, demanding work. Dufour was no longer just restoring history, he was bringing it forward. This was an exciting time for Dufour, but it didn't last. One day, Audemars Piguet called him. There was an issue with 2 watches he had delivered, but the issue wasn't Dufour's. The first watch had been shattered, broken into pieces. The glass was cracked, the dial and the hands were gone. The second was even worse. The case was deeply dented, the glass cracked again, and once more, the dial and hands were missing. When Dufour saw this, he was furious. He demanded to know what had happened, why hadn't the watches been protected, and as it turned out, he had every right to be angry. Someone from the company had been transporting the watches. Instead of placing them in their travel case, he slipped one into his jacket pocket. As he got out of the car, the jacket got caught in the closing door. The door slammed shut. The watch was crushed. A piece worth roughly £500,000 destroyed in a single careless moment. He later said, "When I saw them, my blood ran cold. One was half shattered, the other nearly destroyed. An indescribable shock. How could anyone treat pieces born from thousands of hours of labor this way? How could there be such a lack of respect for an artisan's work?" That day, I made a vow, never again would I work for someone else. This time the decision was final. From that moment, my work would depend on no one but myself. This resolve would set stage for Dufour's next chapter, one that would cement his legacy as an independent artist. At 41, Dufour decided to create watches under his own name. Fresh from the AP incident, he took a step back and looked at the market. He wanted his first wristwatch to truly stand out. He knew there was nothing fundamentally new left to invent in watchmaking, and he had no interest in chasing novelty. So he decided to attempt something no one had done before, putting a Grande Sonnerie mini repeater into a wristwatch. This was an extremely bold move. At the time, late 1980s, even major manufacturers hadn't figured out how to miniaturize a Grande Sonnerie into a wristwatch. It was considered perhaps the most complex mechanical complication. Yet he was Dufour, a lone craftsman in a converted farmhouse workshop, declaring that he would do it himself. Dufour quietly began designing the Sentier wristwatch in 1989. He worked in near total secrecy, but this wasn't just a technical challenge. It needed time and a lot of money. Dufour was a tiny independent watchmaker. No Swiss bank was interested in funding an experiment this risky. No investors were lining up either. So he took the risk himself. He mortgaged his house just to pay for parts and materials. Still, it wasn't enough. This time, help came from a foreign land. It came from Italy. An Italian patron, a man named Fumi, believed in what Dufour was trying to do and gave him the financial support he needed to keep going. To turn an impossible idea into a real watch. 2.5 years of relentless work followed, essentially living in his workshop, pushing the boundaries of micromechanics to achieve what many thought impossible. By 1992, the masterpiece was ready. Dufour unveiled his wristwatch at the Basel World Fair in April 1992. It was a world first, the most complex of complications successfully miniaturized into a wristwatch by a single independent watchmaker. One might expect overnight fame from such an accomplishment, but reality was more harsh. Dufour's groundbreaking watch was displayed at Basel almost anonymously, lost among the massive glittering booths of the big brands. There was no marketing, no famous name drawing crowds. As he later noted, to achieve the impossible, to achieve a groundbreaking technical feat and yet remain invisible. It was a bittersweet feeling. Moreover, the project had nearly bankrupted him. To make matters worse, he encountered the less savory side of the industry. Various companies offered to buy his innovation or hire him, but on the condition that he sacrifice his independence and work under their brand. Dufour flatly refused these offers, unwilling to compromise on his principles. Then, serious tensions erupted with his Italian partner. According to Dufour, the partner did not understand how long true watchmaking takes. He expected quicker results. The disagreement escalated into open conflict. At one point, Dufour had to place his first Grande Sonnerie wristwatch along with his plans, drawings, and work into a safe. Everything was frozen while lawyers stepped in, and long discussions followed. It was a painful and uncertain period. Over time, he chose to move forward independently, taking full control of his work and direction as a watchmaker. Against all odds, he held firm. And remember, this wasn't a young man's gamble. Dufour had already spent more than 2 years on this project. He had drained his savings, he was in his 40s, and he had children depending on him. As he will later say, continuing under such conditions required extraordinary strength of character. Perhaps it was my origins, or the upbringing I had received, that had shaped me this way. Never sell out, never give in. At that point, everything was uncertain. Then, unexpectedly, recognition came from the other side of the world. A Singaporean friend, David Lee, believed deeply in what Dufour was doing. He convinced him to fly to Singapore and present 2 pieces. The Grande Sonnerie No. 1 as a pocket watch, and the Grande Sonnerie No. 1 as a wristwatch. What followed were 10 intense days, 10 days of conversations, meetings, and long, passionate discussions about craft, value, and what these watches truly represented. That trip, he would later say, taught him lessons that stayed with him throughout his life. In the beginning, the business side of watchmaking was completely new to him. He made mistakes, big ones. In meetings, when buyers asked about a discount, he took it personally. On more than one occasion, he slammed his hand on the table and said, "There is no discount. This is the only watch in the world." To him, the watch represented years of sacrifice and craftsmanship. The idea of lowering the price felt almost insulting. But he was learning that business was also about culture. In Singapore, negotiations were firm, but they were never hostile. Even after tense discussions, his counterparts would pick him up in the evening for dinner or drinks. Business was business, but relationships were separate. That distinction was new to him. It was difficult, humbling even, but it was also a turning point. At the end of those 10 days, both watches found buyers, and more than that, 3 new orders were placed, sealed with nothing more than a handshake. No contracts, no lawyers, no fine print, just a given word. And in Asia, a given word holds meaning. Looking back, these were the moments that mattered most to Dufour. Moments where human relationships came before money, where trust came before paperwork, where he did everything himself, from conception to creation, all the way to the sale. That, to him, was true independence. It was also during this time that he understood something crucial. In places like China and Japan, craftsmanship mattered deeply. The handmade was respected. Excellence was recognized. The values that had always guided him in his work, authenticity, honesty, patience, finally found their audience. And for the first time, Dufour realized that his independence was not a weakness, it was his greatest strength. He would later comment, "Independence, which I have always defended, is a necessity. To be free is to remain true to one's ethics, never betray one's value, and refuse compromise. It is a battle, a struggle against a world where everything becomes standardized, predictable, and soulless." But this fight is not limited to watchmaking. It is universal. It concerns every artisan, every creator, every individual who refused to bow to the dictates of convenience. The Grande Sonnerie mini repeater was produced in very limited numbers. Only 8 were made. They were built slowly between 1992 and 2016, sold quietly to serious collectors, gradually refining the market for independent watchmaking. In 2008, the Grande Petite Sonnerie No. 2, completed in 1995, was sold at Christie's. It was estimated between 250,000 to 350,000 Swiss francs at the time, around 345,000 to 480,000 US dollars in 2026, already an enormous price then. In 2020, the Grande Petite Sonnerie No. 7, the rare open sapphire dial version, was sold at Philips for $3.7 million, around $4.65 million in 2026. In 2021, the very first one, the 1992 Grande Petite Sonnerie No. 1, the world's first Sentier wristwatch, was sold at Philips for $5.2 million, about $6.3 million in 2026. It became the most expensive Dufour wristwatch ever sold at auction. Also, in 2021, the Grande Petite Sonnerie No. 3, originally made in 1995 for the Sultan of Brunei, was sold privately through a collector man for around $7.63 million, about $9.2 million in 2026, making it one of the most expensive independent watches ever sold. The remaining pieces, number 4, 5, 6 and 8, have largely remained in private collections, rarely appearing in public sales. 8 watches, 3 decades of work, and today, they are considered among the most important wristwatch ever created. In 1996, Dufour was 48 years old. He had just done something most watchmakers wouldn't even dare to attempt, a Grande Sonnerie mini repeater wristwatch. For a lone independent, this was supposed to be the summit, the kind of thing you retire on. But instead of slowing down, Dufour felt restless. He needed another challenge, something meaningful, something honest. What he didn't want was the easy route. At the time, tourbillons were everywhere, brands were pumping them out, turning what was once a serious chronometric experiment into a visual gimmick. And Dufour had always been blunt about it. "I'm not in favor of a tourbillon in a wristwatch, because you are the tourbillon of your watch." So he went looking, backwards. He dug into old books and catalogs, especially from the Rockford Time Museum in the US, some dating back to the 1930s. This was watchmaking before marketing departments, where knowledge was passed hand to hand, teacher to student, in the Vallée de Joux. Back then, students didn't just take exams. They built eagle-eye watches, school watches, one-off pieces meant to prove everything they had learned. And among these forgotten watches, Dufour noticed something strange and beautiful. Some of them had 2 balance wheels. Now a balance wheel is essentially the beating heart of a mechanical watch. In a mechanical watch, energy is stored in springs. But energy alone isn't useful. You need a way to release it slowly and evenly. Otherwise, the watch will just spin wildly and stop. That's where the balance wheel comes in. The balance wheel is a small metal wheel that swings back and forth, again and again, at a steady rhythm, not spinning freely, oscillating, like a tiny pendulum. Attached to the balance wheel is a very tiny spring called the hairspring. When the balance wheel turns one way, the hairspring tightens. When it turns back, the hairspring loosens. This push and pull keeps the wheel spinning at a controlled speed. Think of it like a playground swing. Push it too hard and it swings faster. Let it go, and gravity brings it down. The timing stays predictable. Now the watch's gears are designed so that each swing of the balance wheel allows the gears to move forward just a tiny bit. So every oscillation releases a small, controlled amount of energy. This advances the hands slightly, keeping time moving forward in tiny, precise steps. And here's the tricky part. Gravity, position, temperature, and tiny imperfections all affect how it swings. If it swings slightly faster, the watch runs fast. If it swings slightly slower, the watch runs slow. That's why watchmakers obsess over it, polishing it, adjusting it, tweaking it by fractions of a millimeter. Because if you control the balance wheel, you control time. So a double balance wheel. This was the spark. It's not a trend, not a novelty. A forgotten idea, quietly sleeping in history. Exactly what Dufour was looking for. But Dufour knew reading wasn't enough. You don't understand a mechanism like this until you build it. So he did what he always did. He went back to the bench. He designed a completely new movement around the idea of two balances working together. The hardest part wasn't the balances themselves, it was the differential. A differential is basically a referee. It compares the speed of both balances and outputs the average of the two. So instead of relying on a single imperfect heartbeat, the watch listens to two and smooths out their mistakes. For months, he experimented, adjusted, scrapped parts, started again. Slowly, through trial and error, he mastered the system. The result? More stable timekeeping, less variation as the watch moves on the wrist, accuracy through balance, not force. He called it the Duality. In 1996, this was almost unheard of. Double balance wristwatches simply didn't exist in the era. Pocket watches, yes, but on the wrist, no one had done it. Only 9 Duality were made. These watches were sold to top collectors worldwide, and decades later they would command astronomical prices. In 2007, the Duality numbered 00 in platinum was sold for 180,000 Swiss francs, around $250,000 US dollars in 2026. In 2017, this same watch that was sold a decade ago, Duality numbered 00 in platinum was sold for 915,000 US dollars, around $1.2 million in 2026, by the same person who bought it then. In 2021, the Duality number 8 in pink gold sold for 3.6 million Swiss francs, around $5 million in 2026. In 2024, the Duality number 10 was sold for 1.5 million Swiss francs, around $2 million in 2026. The most recent one, in December 2025, the Duality number 1 in white gold was sold for $3,085,000 US dollars. By the end of the 1990s, Philippe Dufour had a small but illustrious catalogue of creations to his name, namely the Grande Sonnerie pocket and wristwatches, and the Duality. His achievements did not go unnoticed by the broader watchmaking community. In 1998, he was honoured with the Prix Gear in the craftsmanship and creation category, often called the Nobel Prizes of watchmaking. The Gear Award recognized Dufour's contribution to preserving and advancing traditional horology. He was now acknowledged by his peers and experts as a major voice in the field. However, Dufour would pivot to a project that ironically was far simpler on the surface, yet became his most celebrated work. The idea came from a place deeply connected to his story. Japan, the country that had once shaken the Swiss watch industry during the Quartz Crisis. The country that had nearly erased mechanical watchmaking, and yet, years later, it was Japan that showed the deepest respect for traditional handmade watches. In Tokyo, a Philippe Dufour fan club had formed. They admired what he could do with complicated watches, but they challenged him in a different direction. They challenged him to create a simple watch, one of absolute perfection. In the year 2000, at the age of 52, Philippe Dufour launched the watch that would define his legacy in the eyes of many, the simplicity. After making some of the most complicated watches in existence, Dufour deliberately conceived the simplicity to strip horology down to its essence. It is a time-only watch, displaying just hours, minutes, and seconds with a beautifully classical design inspired by the watches from the 1950s and 60s. On the surface, it's visually very simple. It does the opposite of what many famous watches do. A Richard Mille RM011 tells you everything up front. Carbon cases, open dials, shock structures. You see the complexity immediately. An AP Royal Oak double balance shows its mechanics proudly. A Patek Philippe Grand complication doesn't hide what it is. You're meant to notice how much is happening. The simplicity doesn't play that game. Plain hands, a simple dial, no visual fireworks. The real magic of the simplicity lies in its hand finishing, and this is where the simplicity really stands out. In watchmaking, finishing means the careful shaping, polishing, and decorating of all the tiny metal parts after they're made. It doesn't change what the watch does. The goal is to make every surface beautiful, precise, and pleasant to look at, even the parts most people will never see. And when people talk about watch finishing, you often hear the word enlarge. Enlarge means the edges of the metal parts are beveled and polished by hand so that they catch the light beautifully. Dufour's enlarge is especially admired because the bevels are wide, smooth, and include sharp inward corners that only skilled hands can execute properly. The movement also has Geneva stripes, smooth, flowing lines brush into the metal that creates an illusion of depth and movement through reflected light. They don't change performance, they are purely there to show craftsmanship and to make the movement visually elegant. Every tiny parts are treated with the same care. The screw heads and jewels are polished until they shine like mirrors. And everything as small as the click springs, a part most people will never notice, is shaped beautifully and is finished with black polishing, a technique where the surface becomes so smooth it looks black at certain angles. Dufour treated the simplicity like a showcase of pure craftsmanship, the kind of watch made not to impress with features, but to show how perfect the basics can be. That's the paradox of the simplicity. It looks simple, but inside, it's anything but simple. But behind every watch, there's more than just craft and precision. There's companionship, mentorship, and sometimes grief. For Dufour, the simplicity wasn't just a culmination of his technique. It was a collaboration, one shaped with the hands and hearts of someone else. Gabriel Locatelli. Gabriel wasn't just a colleague, he was Dufour's first mentor at JLC in the late 1960s, the kind of master who didn't just pass down knowledge, but a philosophy of discipline, of obsession, of treating every component as sacred. Their early works together in JLC's laboratory workshop laid the foundations of Dufour's obsessive pursuit of perfection. Years later, disillusioned by the direction modern watchmaking had taken, Gabriel rejoined Dufour in his quiet workshop in the Vallée de Joux. There, the two reunited, this time to create the simplicity. What started as a watch soon became a tribute. In 2000, just months after the simplicity debuted at Basel, tragedy struck. Gabriel died in a sudden car accident. It left Dufour shattered. He couldn't bring himself to enter the workshop, and for a while he considered giving it all up. But eventually, he returned, not just for himself, but for Gabriel. Because in every bevel, every mirror-polished screw, every silver of inward Anglage, Dufour knew Gabriel was still there. Dufour later wrote, because every simplicity, in its pursuits of perfection, in its meticulous attention to detail, extends their legacy with the same unwavering dedication. Gabriel lives on through each of my gestures, and the simplicity became more than just a watch. It became a memorial, an expression of gratitude, of grief, and of a friendship that ticked with the same precision as the movement they built together. Originally, Dufour intended to make only 100 simplicity watches, offered in the modest 34mm case size. However, the response from collectors was overwhelming. He quickly received requests for a larger version, so he slightly re-engineered the movement to fit a 37mm case. He refused to simply put a spacer ring, instead redesigning the layout of the new size. Ultimately, over a 17-year period, Dufour produced 204 simplicity pieces between 2000 and 2017. Even with this number of watches, demand still far exceeded supply. Clients had to patiently wait years for their watch, and acquiring a simplicity became a famously difficult endeavor. One could not just walk in and buy one. Prospective buyers often needed an introduction, or to be personally approved by Dufour, sometimes with the past clients vouching for them, to ensure each watch went to a true enthusiast. Here are some of the prices the simplicity had achieved at auction. In 2020, the Simplicity 20th Anniversary number 00 was sold at Philips Geneva for 1,361,000 Swiss francs, around $2 million in 2026. In 2025, the Simplicity number 1 was sold at Philips New York for $1,168,400, around $1.25 million in 2026. In 2025, the Simplicity of the Grey Dial was sold at Philips Hong Kong for $6,223,000 Hong Kong dollars, around $1 million in 2026. Notably, more than half of all the Simplicity watches were sold to collectors in Japan. The Japanese had ironically been the ones to spark the Quartz Crisis decades earlier. Yet by the 2000s, Japan had a thriving community of mechanical watch connoisseurs who deeply appreciated craftsmanship. Dufour's philosophy resonated strongly with Japanese culture's reverence for traditional artistry, from samurai sword making to tea ceremonies, so it's perhaps no surprise that his watches found a special home there. The simplicity elevated Dufour to sort of a legend. By championing time-honored techniques and uncompromising quality, in an age of globalization and mass luxury, he set a new benchmark. Despite the fame, Dufour remained a down-to-earth figure, working quietly at his bench in the Swiss countryside. He has no large factory or mass production line, just a converted schoolhouse in Les Joliet, which serves as his atelier filled with classical tools, sketches, and a haze of pipe smoke from his ever-present pipe. He often emphasizes that he keeps no trade secrets and is happy to share knowledge with the next generation, saying, "There are graveyards full of secrets, and that's enough." In this spirit, Dufour co-founded the Time Eon Foundation to teach traditional watchmaking skills to young artisans and to keep them alive in the digital age. Entering the 2020s, Philippe Dufour remained as an active and revered figure in horology, even as he passes age 75. Around this time, recognizing both his advancing age and his interest in his brand, Dufour took steps to secure his legacy. In early 2020, he partnered with a prominent Lebanese collector, Claude Sphere, who agreed to handle the business and commercial side going forward. Today, collectors hoping to buy a new Philippe Dufour watch must go through Sphere, who manages the location. But these watches rarely go to strangers. They are typically reserved for collectors who had known Dufour for years, people who had followed his work, supported independent watchmaking, and earned his trust. For everyone else, the only realistic path is the secondary market, where Dufour's watches appear at auction only occasionally, often selling for millions. This partnership with Sphere allowed Dufour to focus on the craft itself and also brought his family closer to the fore. Behind the scenes, his wife Elizabeth helped run the workshop, managing the small but constant flow of collectors, orders, and correspondence that came with Dufour's growing reputation. And most importantly, their youngest daughter, Daniela Dufour, joined the workshop as an apprentice watchmaker. Daniela Dufour had expressed interest in watchmaking from a young age, even building a functional wooden clock for her father when she was 12. But Dufour initially tried to dissuade her, perhaps knowing the difficult path ahead. She persisted, enrolling in the same watchmaking school that Dufour had attended decades prior, and graduated in 2021. Since then, Daniela had been working alongside her father, absorbing his techniques and philosophy. In 2021, she completed her first watch, fitting into one of the anniversary simplicity pieces, assembled and finished with her own hands under Philippe's guidance. Philippe Dufour had thus come full circle. Once the boy who inherited a few tools from his grandfather, he is now the mentor passing down the tools and the know-how to his daughter. It is a rare multi-generational continuation in independent watchmaking, and a hopeful sign that the Dufour name, and more importantly, his uncompromising standards will live on. Over his career, from 1992 to 2020, he produced only about 230 watches in total, each a labor of love. In the story of Philippe Dufour, we find a rich narrative of tradition versus change, a man who battled the headwinds of technology and industry upheave by doubling down on heritage and quality. His life was not smooth. He struggled in school. He watched his trade nearly disappear during the Quartz Crisis. He pushed back against corporate thinking, but every obstacle shaped him. It strengthened his belief in doing things the old way, the hard way, the right way. He created world-first watches, he received international honors, but those are just milestones, not the core of his story. The real story is simpler. A man at a bench, a few tools, a movement taking shape, piece by piece. And in his own words, throughout my journey I have remained true to my principles. I never succumbed to the siren songs of investors, industrial groups or financiers who sought to turn me into a commercial brand rather than a craftsman. I never paid attention to the jeers and mockery of marketing experts who told me that my approach was outdated, that independent watchmaking had no future. I never followed trends, nor do I seek to please. I simply did what I know best, what I was born to do. I am a watchmaker, and I have remained one. This is episode 1 of Crafted Gallery. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, consider hitting the subscribe button, leaving a like, post a comment, tell a friend. It allows me to keep making stories like this, stories with the depth they deserve. And if you're listening on audio, you can find Crafted Gallery on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcast platforms. I'll see you in the next episode.